Imagine a world where half the population vanishes in just a few years. A world gripped by fear, where death lurks in every shadow. This was the reality of the Black Death, a pandemic that didn't just kill millions, but fundamentally reshaped the course of human history. The Black Death stands as a monumental event in human history. It was a turning point that irrevocably altered the medieval world. This devastating disease emerged in the early 1340s. It spread with terrifying speed and efficiency. The pandemic caused unprecedented mortality across continents. This plague originated in Asia. It traveled westward along established trade routes. It reached and ravaged numerous lands. At its peak, the Black Death claimed between 25 and 50 million lives. This staggering figure represented roughly half of Europe's total population. It profoundly changed daily life, woke, and perceptions of mortality. Scientists today believe the plague began in regions like China, India, or Egypt. Its rapid spread highlighted the interconnectedness of medieval societies. It also demonstrated the vulnerability of these networks to disease transmission. The Black Death was a plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It struck Europe with immense force. It is estimated to have killed around 25 million people between 1347 and 1352. This death toll represented nearly 40% of Europe's population at the time. The pandemic was a critical moment for understanding human resilience and adaptation. It offers deep insights for anthropology and archaeology. The disease manifested in 3 primary forms. Each type carried a different, but often deadly prognosis. These were the bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic plagues. The bubonic form was the most common. It had a mortality rate ranging from 30% to 75%. This type was characterized by swollen lymph nodes. The pneumonic plague attacked the lungs. It was far more lethal, with a mortality rate of 90% to 95%. It could spread directly from person to person through the air. The septicemic plague infected the bloodstream. It was almost universally fatal. Its mortality rate was between 99% and 100%. The pandemic's origins trace back to Central Asia. The first recorded outbreaks occurred in 1338 to 1339. These early cases set the stage for its global spread. The plague reached the Mediterranean basin by 1347. It arrived via merchant ships. From there, it rapidly infiltrated coastal cities and moved inland. Its spread was facilitated by the extensive trade routes of the era. These networks connected distant regions. They inadvertently became pathways for the deadly bacterium. Local communities were hit with brutal intensity. The disease often overwhelmed their limited resources and understanding. Entire villages and towns could be decimated in weeks. The plague spread primarily through infected black rats and their fleas. These rodents were common companions on ships and in urban areas. Their presence ensured the disease's wide distribution. This biological vector dramatically altered the demographics of the medieval world. Population structures were shattered. The balance between urban and rural life shifted. In some severely affected areas, survival rates were shockingly low. Historical accounts suggest that in the worst-hit places, only 10 people out of 1,000 might survive. This level of mortality was unprecedented. The Black Death was a pandemic that challenged existing world cultures. It forced a reevaluation of traditional narratives and beliefs. Researchers have meticulously investigated its origins. Their work utilizes both historiography and primary sources. These methods help piece together the puzzle of the plague's beginnings. They provide crucial clues about its initial spread. Studies strongly suggest the Black Death originated in Central Asia. An area near modern-day Kyrgyzstan is often cited. This region served as a likely epicenter. Archaeological findings support this theory. Tombstones discovered there date back to 1338 and 1339. These inscriptions provide some of the earliest known evidence of the pandemic. The disease's transmission was intrinsically linked to trade networks. It exploited the routes that connected far-flung populations. These connections, vital for commerce, became conduits for death. Key pathways for its spread included the famous Silk Road trade routes. Overland caravans carried goods and, unknowingly, the plague. This ancient network facilitated its movement across Asia. Maritime commerce was another critical vector. Ships sailing the Mediterranean and Atlantic carried infected rats and fleas. Port cities became the first points of entry in new regions. Military campaigns also played a role. Armies on the move could carry the disease to new territories. Sieges, in particular, could expose large groups to infection. The Yersinia pestis bacterium underwent genetic changes in the early 1300s. This evolution likely enhanced its ability to spread rapidly. It became a highly efficient killer. An estimated 50 million people died in Europe and the Mediterranean region. This occurred between 1346 and 1353. The scale of death was almost unimaginable. The pandemic was far more than a health crisis. It fundamentally reshaped the economy and society. Its impact resonated across numerous cultures. The Black Death was a catastrophe that unfolded rapidly across medieval Europe. It was a pandemic characterized by its swift movement and devastating mortality. Understanding its timeline reveals the speed of its advance. The plague first made landfall in Europe at key entry points. It arrived in Crimean ports. Genoese trading ships carried infected rats and fleas. From the Crimea, it quickly spread. It reached major cities and trade centers. These urban hubs became epicenters of infection. The first documented cases in Europe were in Sicily in 1347. The disease arrived on ships from the east. It immediately began to take hold. It then moved swiftly to Constantinople. This major Byzantine city was a crossroads of trade. Its dense population was highly vulnerable. Following its arrival in the east, it hit the Italian peninsula with speed. Cities like Genoa, Venice, and Florence were among the first affected. Their extensive trade links ensured rapid dissemination. The plague spread across the continent with terrifying speed. It killed an estimated 25 million people in Europe. This represented between 30% and 60% of the total population. Cities were particularly hard hit. Their crowded conditions facilitated transmission. Death rates could reach as high as 70% in some urban centers. The pandemic's main wave lasted from 1347 to 1351. This relatively short period saw immense societal upheaval. Europe was profoundly changed by the experience. By the end of the 14th century, Europe's population had plummeted. It fell from an estimated 135 million to around 100 million. The demographic landscape was permanently altered. Major events marked the plague's progression. In 1347, the plague entered Europe through Crimea. This marked the beginning of the continent's ordeal. 1348 saw widespread transmission across Mediterranean regions. Italy, France, and Spain were severely affected. The death toll began to mount rapidly. 1349 marked the peak mortality across major European kingdoms. England, Germany, and Scandinavia felt the full force of the pandemic. Society struggled to cope. By 1351, the initial pandemic wave began its gradual decline. While outbreaks would recur, the first, most devastating phase was ending. Europe began the long process of recovery. The Black Death's impact extended far beyond mortality. It reshaped Europe's economy, society, and culture. Its consequences would be felt for centuries. The Black Death was a devastating biological assault. It inflicted terrible suffering on its victims. Examining its effects through an anthropological lens reveals the vulnerability of medieval populations to novel pathogens. People afflicted by the Black Death exhibited horrifying symptoms. These manifestations rapidly overwhelmed the body. The disease progressed with brutal speed. Key physical signs included a high fever and extreme chills. Victims often experienced severe muscle and joint pain. These symptoms signaled the body's fight against the infection. The most characteristic symptom was the appearance of swollen lymph nodes. These painful swellings were called buboes. They typically appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck. The infection spread quickly throughout the body. Without treatment, which was unavailable, death was often swift. Many victims succumbed within days of symptom onset. Historical records vividly describe the suffering. Accounts detail the appearance of the buboes. These swellings were a grim indicator of the disease's progression. The plague also inflicted deep psychological devastation. Survivors and those witnessing the death toll experienced profound trauma. Medieval accounts speak of widespread panic and despair. Stories from the time describe social collapse. As death rates soared, communities struggled to maintain order. Fear and grief were pervasive emotions. People felt an extreme fear of contagion. The invisible enemy was everywhere. This constant threat created immense anxiety. Deep sadness over the immense loss of life was widespread. Families were decimated. Communities were hollowed out. Many survivors felt emotionally drained and numb. The sheer scale of death was overwhelming. Coping mechanisms were stretched to their breaking point. The psychological effects extended beyond individual trauma. The plague changed societal attitudes towards death. It also influenced perceptions of mental health and suffering. The Black Death triggered significant transformations in medieval world cultures. It challenged established social structures. Communities were forced to innovate and adapt to survive. These responses highlighted both human vulnerability and resilience. Societies grappled with an unprecedented crisis. Their reactions shaped the future. Medieval societies implemented novel measures to combat the plague. They experimented with public health strategies. These were early attempts at disease control. Early forms of quarantine were introduced. Cities isolated the sick. They attempted to prevent further spread. City gates were often closed. This drastic measure aimed to stop the disease from entering or leaving. It disrupted trade and travel, but was seen as necessary. Isolation zones were created for the infected. Plague hospitals or lazarettos were established. These facilities aimed to contain the outbreak. Urban areas suffered more intensely than rural ones. Their density facilitated transmission. Cities became laboratories for public health experimentation. Religious groups had varied and significant reactions. The plague profoundly impacted faith and religious institutions. People sought meaning and solace in different ways. Some interpreted the plague as divine punishment. They believed it was God's wrath for human sin. This view fueled fear and calls for repentance. Others saw it as an opportunity for spiritual growth. They turned to prayer and piety. They hoped to earn divine mercy. Flagellant movements emerged across Europe. Groups of penitents publicly whipped themselves. They sought forgiveness through self-inflicted suffering. The plague killed many clergy members. Priests, monks, and nuns died while caring for the sick. This loss weakened the church's authority and caused spiritual anxiety. Hospitals evolved during this period. They shifted from simple isolation centers. They began to offer more comprehensive care for the sick. This development marked a significant step forward in medical practice. The crisis spurred innovation in healthcare. It changed the role of institutions like hospitals. The Black Death had profound and lasting effects on the medieval European economy. It dramatically reshaped labor markets and trade networks. This event caused unprecedented changes to social and economic structures. The pandemic posed immense challenges to world cultures. It disrupted established patterns of production and exchange. The economic landscape was permanently altered. The pandemic resulted in massive population losses. This created a severe labor shortage. The balance of power between workers and employers shifted dramatically. With fewer people available for work, laborers gained leverage. They could demand better wages and conditions. This challenged the traditional feudal system. Wages for both skilled and unskilled laborers increased significantly. In some areas, wages rose by 50% or more. This represented a major economic shift. The reduced workforce strengthened workers' bargaining power. Peasants and artisans could negotiate terms. They were no longer easily replaceable. This period accelerated the decline of traditional feudal economic systems. The manorial system, based on tied labor, became less viable. A more market-oriented economy began to emerge. Trade routes were severely disrupted during the pandemic. The movement of goods slowed or stopped. Fear of contagion hampered commerce. Regions like Spain experienced significant economic slowdowns. Recovery took nearly a century in some areas. The economic shock was long-lasting. Egypt and other regions also struggled to maintain their complex economies. The drastic reduction in population made it difficult to sustain production and trade. Supply chains broke down. The Black Death's economic consequences were far-reaching. It led to long-term changes in wealth distribution. It also altered the organization of societies across Europe. The Black Death profoundly impacted religious belief and practice across medieval world cultures. It presented immense challenges to religious institutions. The spread of the disease shook the foundations of cultural heritage. People grappled with theological questions. Why was God allowing such suffering? How should the faithful respond? The Catholic Church, the dominant religious institution in Europe, was severely affected. Many clergy members died. They contracted the plague while ministering to the sick and dying. This loss of religious leaders created a crisis of faith for some. It also weakened the Church's institutional capacity. The spiritual guidance structure was damaged. Responses to the pandemic varied widely within medieval Europe. Different groups and individuals reacted in distinct ways. These reactions shaped religious practices. The rise of flagellant movements was a notable response. These groups sought divine mercy through public acts of penance. They believed their suffering could appease God. New saints associated with protection against the plague emerged. People prayed to these figures for intercession. They sought supernatural aid against the disease. Burial and mourning rituals underwent radical changes. The sheer volume of dead overwhelmed traditional practices. Mass graves became common. Increased public displays of penance became frequent. People sought to demonstrate their piety. They hoped to avert God's perceived wrath. Many interpreted the Black Death as a sign of God's anger. This interpretation influenced religious thought and behavior. It reinforced a focus on sin and judgment. Some groups resorted to extreme acts. Public self-flagellation was one such practice. It reflected a desperate search for atonement. The pandemic forced medieval religious groups to reevaluate their beliefs. They had to confront suffering on an unprecedented scale. They considered new ideas about faith, divine will, and the role of God in the world. The Black Death fundamentally altered medieval society. It delivered a severe blow to the feudal system in Europe. This event was a key moment in anthropology, exposing the vulnerabilities within the social order. The rigid hierarchy of feudalism began to crumble. The pandemic's demographic impact was the primary catalyst. Society was forced to adapt to a new reality. The pandemic caused massive demographic shifts. Europe's population plummeted by 30 to 60%. This created a severe labor shortage across the continent. This drastic reduction in available workers gave peasants and serfs leverage. They were in high demand. They could negotiate for better working conditions and freedom. Peasant wages increased significantly in many areas. Some estimates suggest a rise of around 50%. This improved their economic standing. A substantial portion of the peasantry gained freedom. approximately 20% of serfs were able to escape their tied status. They became free laborers or tenants. Workers could now demand better terms from landowners. Landlords had to compete for labor. This weakened their traditional authority. The decline of traditional feudal structures accelerated. The personal ties that bound lords and vassals weakened. Money and contractual agreements became more important than inherited status. Nobles lost some of their power and influence. Their wealth was often tied to land and the labor to work it. The labor shortage diminished the value of land. The social structures of ancient civilizations, upon which feudalism was built, were profoundly changed. Peasant uprisings became more common. These revolts demonstrated the shifting power dynamics. The English Peasants' Revolt in 1381 is a prime example. It was fueled by peasant grievances and the new opportunities created by the labor shortage. It showed the depth of social change. New laws were enacted in response to these changes. Statutes of laborers attempted to fix wages, but were largely ineffective. The decline of feudal courts and the rise of common law also marked a new era. The Black Death left an indelible mark on European culture. It profoundly influenced world cultures through new artistic expressions and philosophical ideas. Primary sources from the era reveal how people perceived the world differently in the face of such immense loss. Medieval art underwent significant changes. Artists grappled with the overwhelming reality of death. The experience shaped their creative output. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a prominent artistic motif. It symbolized the universality of death. It depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life to the grave. Artists depicted scenes of suffering and decay. They showed the physical toll of the disease. Their work reflected the grim reality of the time. Allegories about the brevity of life became common. Art served as a memento mori, a reminder of mortality. It urged viewers to contemplate their own fate. The pandemic prompted shifts in philosophical perspectives. Scholars and thinkers began to question established beliefs. The scale of suffering challenged traditional religious and philosophical frameworks. This period saw the beginnings of new ideas. These perspectives would later contribute to the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance. A greater focus on human experience and the material world emerged. Death became a pervasive theme in art and literature. This reflected the dark mood of the era. The constant presence of death influenced creative expression. Literary responses were crucial for processing the trauma. Writers used their craft to explore the human experience during the plague. They tackled difficult themes. Authors explored themes of existential despair. The fragility of life was starkly apparent. The meaning of existence was questioned. Human weakness in the face of overwhelming forces was a common subject. The inability to stop the plague highlighted human limitations. It contrasted with divine power. Doubts about spiritual certainty also appeared in literature. The death of so many pious individuals and clergy members raised questions. Faith was tested by suffering. Writings from this period provide invaluable insights. They show a society struggling to make sense of immense loss and uncertainty. Literature became a means of collective processing. The Black Death fundamentally reshaped Europe. Its impact extended far beyond the immediate crisis. It influenced anthropology and world cultures in profound and lasting ways. The pandemic was not just a biological event. It was a catalyst for deep societal transformation. Its consequences reverberated for centuries. The pandemic caused dramatic changes in Europe's population dynamics. The number of people plummeted. This demographic shock had cascading effects. Europe's population fell from an estimated 75 to 100 million to 30 to 45 million. This represented a 30 to 60% decrease. The scale of depopulation was unprecedented. This massive population drop altered how people lived and worked. Land became more abundant relative to labor. This shifted economic power. Approximately 25% of villages were abandoned in hard-hit areas. Entire communities vanished. The rural landscape was transformed. Wages in labor markets increased significantly. They rose by 50 to 100% in some regions. Workers benefited from the labor shortage. It took nearly 150 years for Europe's population to recover. Pre-plague levels were not reached again until the 16th century. The demographic recovery was slow. The pandemic spurred significant advancements in public health. Communities learned hard lessons about disease transmission. They developed new strategies for management. Cities became centers for public health innovation. Italian cities, in particular, established quarantine measures and health boards. These were early forms of public health governance. Agricultural productivity decreased significantly. With fewer laborers, less land could be cultivated. Estimates suggest a 40 to 50% decrease in some areas. Urban development saw significant population movement. People migrated towards cities seeking better opportunities. The labor shortage in urban centers attracted workers. Religious practices were also affected long-term. Church attendance dropped in the immediate aftermath. Estimates suggest a decrease of approximately 40%. The Black Death was a pivotal moment in European history. It permanently altered social, economic, and cultural structures. It paved the way for the end of feudalism and the dawn of a new era. Examining the Black Death through the lens of historical scholarship reveals how our understanding has evolved. Historians continue to study this major event. They use a variety of sources to deepen their knowledge. Old documents and records provide crucial insights. They offer glimpses into the experiences of those who lived through the pandemic. These primary sources are invaluable. Writers from the period provided important accounts. They documented the plague's effects on society. Their observations are key historical evidence. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron is a particularly important source. It offers vivid descriptions of the pandemic's impact in Florence. It captures the social and psychological effects. These early writings, though shaped by their time, are highly useful. They provide a foundation for modern research. They offer a human perspective on the crisis. Today, the Black Death is viewed through a new multidisciplinary light. Researchers combine different fields of study. This integrated approach provides a more complete picture. Epidemiological analysis helps understand the disease's spread. Genetic research identifies the pathogen and its evolution. Archaeological evidence reveals burial practices and population changes. Climate historical studies explore environmental factors. These might have influenced the plague's emergence or spread. A holistic approach is now common. The Black Death killed a vast proportion of Europe's population. This occurred between 1346 and 1353. It remains a compelling topic for scholars across disciplines. Mortality rates varied significantly by region. Some areas experienced near total annihilation. Others were less severely affected. Modern historians analyze the plague's impact on society, economy, and culture. They explore its role as a catalyst for change. They use primary sources to understand human agency and resilience. Old documents and sources help us see how people coped. They reveal strategies for survival and adaptation. They show how societies endured this difficult time. Looking at world cultures through the lens of historical events reveals fascinating parallels between pandemics. Anthropology helps us understand how human societies react to health crises across different eras. The Black Death offers valuable points of comparison. The plague of Justinian is an earlier example of a devastating pandemic. It occurred in the 6th century CE. It offers striking similarities to the Black Death. Key similarities include high death rates across diverse populations. Both plagues led to major disruptions in social and economic systems. They had long-term effects on population levels and structures. The Black Death was a catastrophic pandemic that profoundly reshaped medieval Europe. Its impact extended far beyond the immediate death toll. It fundamentally altered society, economy, and culture for centuries to come. Dive deeper into the history of the Black Death, explore the primary sources, examine the art, and understand the long-term consequences. Subscribe to our channel for more historical insights and share this video with fellow history enthusiasts.